The lawyer said my name twice before I realized he was talking to me. Brianna, he repeated gently, sliding a thin manila folder across the desk. I'm sorry. There's nothing left. Nothing. The word hit harder than the grief already sitting in my chest. I stared at the folder like it might explain itself if I waited long enough. My hands were numb, my ears ringing, my father's voice still echoing in my head from the night before his funeral when he whispered, "You're gonna be okay, baby." I made sure of it. He hadn't lied. Someone else had. I don't understand, I said, my voice barely there. My dad had a policy. He showed it to me. He said it was for my school. The lawyer sighed, not surprised, not confused, just tired. The beneficiary was changed 3 months before his death, he said carefully. Your aunt withdrew the full amount 2 weeks after the claim was approved. The room tilted. My aunt, my blood, the woman who hugged me at the funeral and cried louder than anyone else. The same woman who told me, your daddy would be so proud of you, while slipping condolence cards into her purse. I felt sick. Are you sure? I asked, even though the answer was sitting right in front of me in black and white. He nodded. I'm afraid so. I walked out of that office into cold air that burned my lungs. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from my aunt. Checking on you, sweet girl. Call me when you're ready. I didn't reply. I went home to my childhood bedroom, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at the cracked ceiling my dad used to promise he'd fix one day. The same ceiling I'd studied through tears the night he died, whispering prayers into the dark. That night, grief turned into something else. Anger. Not loud, not explosive, the kind that settles deep in your bones and refuses to leave. The next morning, I went to class like nothing had happened, sat in the front row, took notes, answered questions. My professor praised my focus, unaware I hadn't slept at all. During my break, I locked myself in a bathroom stall and cried into my sleeve until my chest ached. Then I wiped my face, because quitting wasn't an option. I picked up a second job that week. Morning shifts at a cafe, night shifts cleaning offices downtown. I studied on buses, balancing textbooks on my knees while strangers stared past me. I slept 4 hours a night if I was lucky, my dad's old hoodie wrapped around me like armor. Every time exhaustion whispered stop, I heard his voice louder. Don't let anybody take what's meant for you. I started asking questions quietly about insurance policies, about beneficiary changes, about timelines. I learned words I shouldn't have had to learn at 19. Fraud, forgery, undue influence. And slowly, something terrifying became clear. She hadn't just taken money. She had planned it. Emails didn't disappear like she thought they did. Bank records left trails. A signature looked different when it wasn't written by the same hand that taught me cursive at the kitchen table years earlier. One night after my shift, I sat alone in the library staring at a scanned document on my screen. My father's name, but not his handwriting. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. That was the moment grief stopped being the heaviest thing I carried. Because now I knew the truth. And once you know the truth, you don't get to unknow it. I closed my laptop slowly, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. She thought I was just a grieving kid, too tired, too broke, too alone to fight back. She was wrong, and what I decided to do next would change everything. The exhaustion became a language I learned to speak fluently. I learned how to smile while my legs shook from standing too long, how to nod in lectures while my mind replayed bank statements instead of biology notes, how to keep my voice steady when customers snapped at me for coffee orders I barely heard over the hum of my thoughts. Every day followed the same rhythm: work, class, work again, study, sleep, if sleep decided to show up. My life narrowed down to survival and proof. I didn't tell anyone what my aunt had done. Not my friends, who already tiptoed around my grief like it might shatter me. Not my professors, who praised my resilience without knowing what it cost. Not my family, who still invited her to Sunday dinners like she hadn't stolen my future with a pen and a lie. Silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. I spent hours in the campus library, not just studying, but researching. Insurance law, estate disputes, forgery indicators. I read until the words blurred, until my eyes burned, until the librarian flicked the lights as a warning that closing time was near. On the bus rides between jobs, I highlighted articles on my phone. I bookmarked legal forums. I copied down phrases I didn't fully understand yet, trusting that understanding would come with time. And it did. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed. The beneficiary change had happened while my father was hospitalized. He'd been on heavy medication, confused some days, weak on others. My aunt had been the one driving him to appointments, the one helping with paperwork, the one insisting she was just making things easier. I remembered how she'd always said, "You don't need to worry about grown folks' business, baby. Focus on school." I had listened. That was my mistake. I requested copies of everything I could legally access: medical timelines, email records, policy documents. Some requests were denied, others took weeks. Every delay felt personal, like the system itself was testing how badly I wanted justice. I wanted it badly enough to bleed for it. There were days I almost quit, days when my body felt like it was folding in on itself, days when I cried in bathroom stalls between shifts, pressing my forehead against cold tile and asking my dad out loud why he trusted her, why he hadn't seen this coming, why he left me to clean up a mess I never made. On one of those days, my aunt called. "Sweetheart," she said softly, her voice coated in concern, "I've been distant. I worry about you." I closed my eyes, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached. "I'm fine," I said. "Well, if you need anything, you know I'd help if I could." The lie slid off her tongue effortlessly. I pictured her standing in her kitchen, my father's insurance money probably paying for the granite countertops she loved to brag about. I imagined the comfort she bought with what was supposed to lift me out of this grind. Something hardened in me then. "I won't need anything," I replied. She paused, just a beat too long. "Okay," she said carefully, "just checking in." When the call ended, I didn't scream. I didn't throw the phone. I opened my laptop. That night, I found it. An email chain between my aunt and an insurance representative, her asking about expediting beneficiary updates, her following up twice, her attaching a document that looked like my father's signature but tilted slightly, uneven in ways his never was. My chest felt tight as I stared at the screen. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't grief clouding judgment. This was theft. I saved everything to multiple drives, emailed copies to myself, printed hard copies at the library, feeding crumpled bills into the printer when my hands shook. I walked out into the cold with a backpack heavier than it should have been. Not because of books, because of truth. That night, I didn't study. I sat on my bed in my childhood room, my father's hoodie pulled over my knees, documents spread around me like evidence at a crime scene. I spoke out loud, my voice steady despite the tears on my face. You didn't raise me to let this go. The next morning, I made my first official report. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't fast, but it was real. And once the process started, there was no turning back. I didn't know how long it would take. I didn't know how ugly it would get. I didn't know how much more it would cost me. What I did know was this. She thought she'd stolen my education. What she actually gave me was an education in power, truth, and endurance. And I was only just beginning to use it. The report didn't change my life overnight. It changed it slowly, quietly, in ways that tested me more than the initial betrayal ever had. Once paperwork entered the system, time stretched, days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Every time my phone rang, my heart jumped, half expecting answers and half dreading more questions. Investigations don't move with urgency when the victim is young, broke, and expected to endure. Still, I endured. I learned how to live inside uncertainty, how to keep going when nothing felt resolved. I memorized class schedules and case numbers with the same precision. My backpack carried textbooks and legal folders side by side, my future and my fight pressed together against my spine. Some professors noticed my exhaustion. "You doing okay, Brianna?" one asked gently after class. I nodded. I always nodded. What I didn't say was that I'd been awake since 4 a.m. studying for a midterm after closing the cafe, or that I'd skipped dinner to print documents, or that grief still crept in at night, quiet and heavy, whispering my father's name like a question I couldn't answer. The investigation required interviews, retelling, repeating, every detail laid out under fluorescent lights while strangers evaluated my pain for legitimacy. I answered everything honestly, even when my voice shook, even when it felt humiliating to explain why I hadn't noticed the changes sooner. Because the truth was simple and devastating. I trusted family. My aunt, meanwhile, played her role flawlessly. She denied everything, claimed confusion, blamed stress, suggested my father must have wanted things that way. She even suggested I was overwhelmed, emotional, looking for someone to blame. That one hurt the most. I overheard family members whispering at gatherings I no longer attended. "She's young. She doesn't understand paperwork. She's making things harder than they need to be." I stopped going altogether. Isolation became another weight I learned to carry. But something unexpected happened during one of the interviews. The investigator paused, scanning a document, her brow furrowing slightly. "Did your father usually sign his name like this?" she asked. I leaned forward, my pulse pounding. "No," I said immediately. "He always looped the B. Always." She nodded slowly. That small moment, barely a minute long, kept me going for weeks. Because someone saw it. Someone believed me. Final exams arrived with brutal timing. I studied through headaches, through tears, through nights where my body begged me to sleep and my mind refused. I passed every class that semester, some with grades higher than I thought possible under the circumstances. Survival sharpened me. During winter break, I worked double shifts, saved every dollar. I stopped dreaming in vague terms and started planning in specifics, budgets, deadlines, contingencies. I was building a future even as the past tried to drag me backward. Then, one afternoon, an envelope arrived. Official. Heavy. My hands trembled as I opened it. The investigation had escalated. Forgery was now being considered. I sat on the floor, back against the wall, reading the letter again and again until the words settled into my bones. This was no longer just my word against hers. This was evidence, consequences. The next time my aunt called, I didn't answer. I watched the phone ring until it stopped, my heart racing, not from fear, but from clarity. She had underestimated me. Everyone had, because they saw a grieving daughter, a tired student, a quiet girl trying to keep her head above water. What they didn't see was the way pain had disciplined me, the way grief had stripped away distraction, the way betrayal had taught me precision. I wasn't loud, I wasn't reckless, I wasn't desperate. I was prepared. And as the investigation moved forward, I understood something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Justice doesn't rush, but it remembers. And soon, it would remember her. Waiting became its own kind of punishment. Not the waiting for answers. That I could handle. It was the waiting for reactions. The slow realization that when betrayal wears a familiar face, people hesitate to call it what it is. Family gatherings continued without me. Birthdays, cookouts, holidays. My absence was discussed more than her actions. I heard it through secondhand conversations, through cousins who still texted me quietly but wouldn't challenge her openly. She's hurting too. She loved your dad. Dragging this out won't bring him back. As if grief excused theft. As if silence was the price of belonging. I learned then that some families don't protect truth, they protect comfort. So I stopped expecting support. Instead, I built stamina. My schedule was brutal. Morning shifts at the cafe started at 5. Classes ran straight through the afternoon. Evenings belonged to the office building downtown, where I scrubbed glass and emptied trash while corporate music hummed softly in the background. By the time I got home, my hands ached and my eyes burned, but I still opened my books. Education wasn't optional, it was resistance. Some nights I fell asleep with highlighters still uncapped, ink stains on my fingers. Other nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment my aunt had smiled at me, every hug that now felt like a performance. I wondered how long she'd been planning this. I wondered if my father ever suspected. I wondered how many people could look at me now and see inconvenience instead of injustice. One afternoon, after a particularly long shift, I checked my email between classes. There it was, a subject line that made my heart slam into my ribs. Request for additional documentation. They wanted more proof, medical records, specific timelines, witness statements. They wanted me to do what no 19-year-old should have to do, reconstruct the final months of her father's life in clinical detail. I almost broke then. I sat on a bench outside the lecture hall, phone trembling in my hand, tears blurring the screen. Around me, students laughed and complained about exams, about professors, about weekend plans. Normal problems, normal lives. I felt so far away from all of it. I wanted to scream, to ask why this was my responsibility, to demand that someone else fight this battle for me. But no one was coming. So I wiped my face and stood up. I spent weeks gathering what they asked for. I requested hospital logs, medication schedules, appointment notes, nurses' signatures. Each document felt like a small cut, proof of how vulnerable my father had been, how dependent he'd grown on people he trusted, including her. The hardest part was reading the medical notes that described his confusion, his weakness, his reliance on family to help him understand paperwork. I read those lines and felt something inside me harden permanently. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about exploitation. I submitted everything. Carefully, methodically, I triple-checked dates, highlighted inconsistencies, attached explanations written in calm, professional language that didn't reveal how badly my hand shook while typing. Then I waited again. Midterms came and went. I aced 2, barely passed 1. I didn't celebrate. Survival doesn't leave room for pride. One night, as I was closing up at the cafe, my manager pulled me aside. "You don't have to do this to yourself," she said quietly. "You look exhausted." I smiled politely. "You don't understand," I replied. She didn't, and that was okay. The call came on a Tuesday morning right before class. I stepped into a quiet stairwell to answer. "Miss Carter," the voice said, "we've reviewed the additional documentation." My breath caught. "There are discrepancies, significant ones," she continued. I closed my eyes, my forehead resting against the cool concrete wall. "They align with forgery and undue influence," she said. "We're moving forward." I didn't cry. I didn't laugh. I slid down the wall and sat on the steps, my chest heaving as months of pressure shifted just enough to let air back in. After I hung up, I stayed there for a long time, not celebrating, not relieved, just steady, because I knew what came next wouldn't be easy. Investigations don't just expose the guilty, they expose everyone who enabled them, everyone who looked away, everyone who told the victim to be quiet for the sake of peace. And my family had done plenty of looking away. That evening, my aunt finally showed up at my door. I hadn't heard her knock over the music playing in my headphones when I opened the door and saw her standing there, arms crossed, jaw tight. I knew something had shifted. "You didn't have to do this," she said. Her voice wasn't gentle anymore. It was sharp, defensive, afraid. I looked at her for a long moment, taking in the woman who'd raised me in pieces, who'd cooked Sunday dinners, who taught me how to braid hair, and who had also stolen from a dying man. "I didn't do this," I said quietly. "You did." Her eyes flashed with anger. "You think you're smarter than everybody now?" she snapped. "You think you're going to ruin this family over money?" I felt something settle into place. This was the moment she revealed herself completely. "I think," I replied calmly, "that you thought I was too young to notice." Her mouth opened, closed. For the first time, she had nothing to say. I stepped back and closed the door. My hand shook after, my heart raced, but underneath it all was something new, certainty. Because the process was no longer theoretical, no longer distant. It was here, it was moving, and it was headed straight towards the truth. And when it arrived, no amount of family silence would be able to stop it. After she left, I locked the door and leaned my forehead against it, breathing through the tremor running through my body. Confrontation always looks different in real life than it does in your head. There was no dramatic yelling, no confessions, no collapse into tears, just two people standing on opposite sides of a truth that could no longer be ignored. And I was done explaining myself. The days that followed were heavy. Word spread fast in a family that thrived on gossip but feared accountability. Calls came in waves, some angry, some pleading, some pretending neutrality. "You should have talked to us first. This didn't have to get legal. You know how she is." As if personality explained fraud, as if blood erased responsibility. I stopped answering. Instead, I focused on what was directly in front of me. Finals were approaching again. Tuition deadlines loomed, bills stacked up with no sympathy for emotional turmoil. I picked up extra shifts, my body moving on muscle memory alone. There were nights I felt hollow, not sad, not angry, just empty out. Grief does that. It drains you slowly, then all at once. One night, while studying for an exam at the library, I felt my phone vibrate repeatedly. I ignored it until the third buzz rattled my concentration. A voicemail. From her. Her voice was unrecognizable, thin, rushed, almost pleading. "Brianna, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is getting out of hand. People are asking questions. Lawyers are involved now. We can fix this privately. Please call me." I deleted it. Not because I was heartless, but because I was finished negotiating with someone who only cared once consequences appeared. A week later, I was formally notified that she had retained legal counsel. The language in the letter was cold, defensive, carefully worded to deny intent while acknowledging procedural irregularities. It felt like reading a stranger's apology written by someone who never planned to mean it. I handed everything to the investigator without comment. Let professionals interpret guilt. The emotional toll, though, was mine alone to carry. I lost weight. Sleep came in fragments. I started keeping granola bars in my bag because sometimes my hands shook too much to cook when I got home. I cried in stairwells and shower stalls, places where echoes swallowed sound and no one asked questions. But I didn't miss a class, didn't miss a shift, didn't miss a deadline. Pain had become routine. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal exam, I sat outside under a tree on campus and finally allowed myself to think about graduation, about walking across a stage my father would never see, about hearing my name called without him in the crowd. That thought hurt more than anything else had. That was when my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered cautiously. "Miss Carter?" A calm voice said. "This is the claims division. We need to speak with you regarding restitution." My breath caught. "Based on our findings, a portion of the funds can be recovered." I closed my eyes. Not all, not everything, but something. "However," they added, "this will involve formal proceedings and family testimony." I exhaled slowly. "I understand," I said. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, watching students pass by, laughing and planning futures that hadn't been interrupted by betrayal. I wasn't jealous. I was different now. That evening, I pulled out my father's old notebook, the one where he used to jot down reminders and quotes he liked. On the last page, written in his uneven handwriting, was a sentence I'd never noticed before. "Do the right thing, even when it costs you." I traced the words with my finger, tears finally spilling over. It's costing me, but I'm still doing it. The legal process escalated quickly after that. Depositions were scheduled, statements requested, family members were asked to choose between honesty and loyalty. Some chose honesty, others disappeared. I learned who I could stand beside and who had only ever stood near me when it was convenient. Through it all, I kept going, because every early morning, every late night, every tear-soaked study session was leading me somewhere, toward a version of myself my father would recognize, strong, focused, unafraid to stand alone. And I knew, no matter how much money was recovered, I had already reclaimed something far more valuable, my voice. And in the next phase of this fight, I was finally ready to use it without hesitation. Finding my voice didn't make things easier. It made them louder. Depositions began like slow-moving storms, scheduled weeks apart, each one dragging more of my private life into fluorescent-lit rooms where strangers analyzed my pain like data points. I sat upright in uncomfortable chairs, hands folded in my lap, answering questions with precision while my heart pounded so hard I worried it would give me away. How close were you to your aunt? Did your father ever mention changing the policy? Why didn't you notice sooner? Every question carried an implication I refused to absorb. I wasn't on trial. The system just wasn't built for grief to be neat. My aunt's version of events shifted with every retelling. Sometimes she claimed my father insisted on the change. Other times she said she only helped finalize paperwork he had already decided on. Once, she suggested I'd misunderstood his intentions because I was young and emotional. That word again, emotional, as if love disqualified me from clarity. But the documents didn't bend the way stories did. Timelines stayed stubborn, signatures stayed wrong, medication records didn't lie about his capacity, and every time she tried to minimize her role, another inconsistency surfaced. Still, the process drained me. I started waking up with my jaw clenched, teeth aching from grinding them all night. Coffee stopped working. My hands shook sometimes when I tried to write. I wondered how many people abandoned their fight, not because they were wrong, but because they were exhausted. I understood the temptation. One night, after a 14-hour day that included a deposition, a closing shift, and an unfinished paper due at midnight, I sat on my bed and stared at my laptop screen until the words blurred completely. I thought about quitting school, just for a semester, just to breathe. The idea scared me more than the workload, because I knew once I stopped, momentum would die, and momentum was the only thing keeping me upright. So I opened my laptop and typed anyway. The paper wasn't my best work, but it was done. I submitted it with 2 minutes to spare and collapsed back against the pillow, my father's hoodie bunched under my cheek. I cried quietly, not from sadness, but from the weight of holding everything together with no room to drop anything. A few days later, something unexpected happened. One of my cousins reached out. She was older, married, someone I hadn't been close to growing up. "I saw the documents," she said over the phone, her voice low. "What she did, it wasn't right." I closed my eyes. "I know," I replied. "I'm willing to testify," she continued, "about the hospital visits, about the paperwork, about what your dad was like near the end." I didn't trust my voice enough to speak. That offer mattered more than she realized, not because it guaranteed victory, but because it cracked the wall of silence my family had built around the truth. After that, one more relative came forward, then another. Not a flood, but enough. Enough to prove I hadn't imagined it, enough to show this wasn't just my grief talking. The day before one of my final exams, my aunt sent me a message. No greeting, no softness. "You've taken this too far." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed back one sentence. "You took it too far when you stole from a dying man." I blocked her number immediately after. I didn't feel powerful. I felt clean. As the semester drew to a close, the legal process reached a critical point. Mediation was scheduled. The possibility of partial restitution became real. Not guaranteed, but real. My attorney, appointed through a student legal aid program, looked at me during our last meeting and said something I'll never forget. "You know," she said, "most people your age would have folded by now." I shrugged. I didn't have the luxury. She smiled softly. "You had integrity. That's rarer." Walking back to campus that afternoon, books heavy in my bag, I felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Not hope, conviction. I was no longer just reacting to betrayal. I was shaping the outcome. And no matter how mediation ended, no matter how much money came back or didn't, I knew one thing for certain. I would walk across that graduation stage, with my head up, with my father's name honored, with a strength I didn't ask for, but I'd earned. And when this was finally over, I would never again doubt my ability to stand alone in the truth. Mediation was scheduled for a Friday morning. I barely slept the night before, not because I was afraid of facing her, but because I was afraid of what it would cost me emotionally to sit in the same room and pretend this was just a dispute, not a violation that had reshaped my entire life. I arrived early, clutching a folder so worn at the edges it felt like an extension of my body. Inside were months of work, timelines, signatures, medical notes, statements from relatives who had finally chosen honesty over comfort. She arrived 10 minutes late. Same perfume, same carefully pressed suit, same look of irritation masked as confidence. She didn't look at me when she sat down. That hurt more than if she had. The mediator explained the process calmly, like this was any other disagreement over property lines or unpaid invoices. I nodded, hands folded, jaw tight. My attorney sat beside me, steady and focused. Then my aunt spoke. She apologized. Not to me, to the room. "I never intended to hurt anyone," she said, voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. "I was trying to protect the family. Brianna's father trusted me. He wanted me to handle things." I felt heat rise in my chest. Protect the family? That phrase again? When it was my turn, I didn't rush. I laid out the facts, the dates, the documents. I explained my father's condition in simple terms. I explained how I had been excluded from decisions deliberately. I explained how I had worked 2 jobs while attending school full-time because money meant for my education had been taken. My voice didn't shake, and that scared her. The mediator asked questions, clarified, cross-checked. Then came the moment I hadn't prepared for. My aunt turned to me directly. "You could have come to me," she said softly. "We could have worked this out without all of this." I looked at her for a long moment. "I did come to you. You lied." Silence filled the room. Her attorney leaned in to whisper something, urgency etched across his face. That was when I knew. This wasn't going the way she planned. After a break, the mediator returned with an offer. Partial restitution, a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no admission of criminal guilt, but clear responsibility. It wasn't everything, but it was accountability. My attorney looked at me. "This is significant," she said quietly. "You don't have to accept, but this is real progress." I stared at the papers, my father's name printed in ink near the top. I thought about the nights I cried alone, the mornings I dragged myself to work, the textbooks balanced on my chest as I slept, the graduation stage waiting somewhere in my future. Then I thought about something else. If I said no, this would drag on. If I said yes, I could finally breathe. "I'll accept," I said. My aunt exhaled sharply, relief flashing across her face. But it didn't last, because as the mediator continued outlining the terms, one final detail emerged, one she hadn't anticipated. The restitution would be documented, publicly accessible, permanent. Her reputation, the one she guarded so fiercely, would carry this stain forever. Her hands trembled. Mine didn't. When we stood to leave, she finally looked at me. "You didn't have to do it this way," she said, bitterness creeping through her tone. I met her gaze calmly. "You didn't have to steal from me." Outside, the air felt different, lighter, sharper, real. It wasn't over, not fully. There were signatures still to be finalized, money still to be transferred, fallout still to come. And I knew once the family learned the truth officially, everything would change. Because mediation wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the aftermath. And I was about to learn exactly who could live with the truth and who couldn't. The aftermath arrived faster than I expected. By Monday morning, messages flooded in from relatives who hadn't spoken to me in months. Some were confused, some were angry. A few were suddenly checking on me, as if concern could be retroactive. The mediation paperwork hadn't even been finalized yet, but the truth had a way of leaking through cracks people thought were sealed. I didn't respond to most of them. I was tired of explaining pain to people who only understood comfort. On campus, life moved forward without waiting for my personal reckoning to settle. Finals week had arrived, ruthless and indifferent. I sat in exam halls surrounded by students tapping pencils and sighing dramatically, and I wondered how many of them knew what it felt like to carry a family war in their backpack. I finished every exam, not perfectly, but honestly, with everything I had left. When the last one ended, I walked out of the building and stood there for a moment, stunned by the absence of urgency. No deadlines, no immediate obligations, just cold air and the unfamiliar feeling of space. That's when it hit me. I didn't know how to rest anymore. Rest felt dangerous, like something bad might happen if I stopped moving, like grief or anger or doubt might finally catch me if I slowed down enough to let them. So instead of going home, I walked. I walked past the library, past the cafe where I still worked mornings, past the bus stop where I'd studied through tears more nights than I could count. Every step felt like closing a chapter I hadn't realized I'd been living inside for so long. That evening, I received an email from my attorney. The restitution timeline was set, the amount confirmed, the documentation finalized. It wasn't the full insurance payout, but it was enough to change my life, enough to ease tuition, enough to reduce my work hours, enough to give me something I hadn't had since my father died, breathing room. I sat on my bed and stared at the screen, my chest tight with emotions that refused to sort themselves neatly. Relief tangled with grief, vindication brushed up against exhaustion. There was no dramatic release, just a quiet, steady sense of having survived something that could have crushed me. The next day, I reduced my shifts, just slightly, just enough to sleep. The first night I got a full 8 hours, I woke up disoriented, unsure of where I was or what I'd missed. My body didn't trust peace yet. Healing, I learned, isn't immediate. It's cautious. A week later, my aunt sent a final message through her attorney. Nothing personal, nothing direct, just confirmation of compliance. No apology, no acknowledgement. I didn't expect one. Apologies are about conscience. Accountability is about action. I got the latter. Family gatherings changed after that. Some people avoided me entirely, like truth was contagious. Others reached out awkwardly, trying to bridge gaps with platitudes and food invitations. I declined most of them. I wasn't angry, I was selective. During winter break, I visited my father's grave for the first time since the mediation. Snow dusted the ground lightly, the world quiet in that way it only is when everything feels paused. I knelt down, brushing ice from the headstone, and spoke softly. I didn't quit, I told him. I wanted to, a lot, but I didn't. I sat there for a long time, memories drifting in and out, his laugh, his advice, the way he used to say my name like it mattered. I realized then that while money could never replace him, it had never really been the point. What I fought for was his intention, his belief in me, his promise that my future mattered. Spring semester started with unfamiliar lightness. I focused better, retained more, learned faster. Professors noticed. One even asked if I'd considered graduate school someday. I smiled politely, the idea settling somewhere deep inside me. Maybe. One day. I graduated that year with honors. When my name was called, I walked across the stage without looking at the crowd. I didn't need to see faces to know who wasn't there. I knew who was. My strength, my persistence, my father's legacy. After the ceremony, I stood outside holding my diploma, sunlight warming my face. Friends hugged me, photos were taken, life kept unfolding. But as I looked down at that piece of paper, something unexpected stirred. A realization. This wasn't the end of my story. It was proof of what I could endure. And as proud as I was of surviving betrayal, I hadn't yet decided what I would do with the woman I had become because of it. That decision was still coming, and when it did, it would shape everything. Graduation should have felt like an ending. Instead, it felt like a beginning I wasn't fully prepared for. The honors cord lay across my dresser like proof I kept touching to make sure it was real. I packed up my dorm room slowly, folding clothes I'd worn through grief, exhaustion, and quiet determination. Each item felt heavy with memory. Each notebook told a story far bigger than the grades written inside. I moved back into my childhood home that summer. The house was quieter than I remembered. My father's chair still sat in the corner of the living room, untouched. His tools remained in the garage exactly where he left them. I cleaned around them, never moving them, like disturbing the space might erase him further. The restitution funds arrived in installments. I used them carefully, intentionally. Tuition first, student loans next, then a small savings account, one with my name on it alone. For the first time, money didn't feel like something that could vanish overnight. It felt earned, protected. My aunt never reached out again. I heard through family that she'd become withdrawn, defensive, angry at everyone except herself. Some relatives blamed me for the distance she created. Others quietly admitted they would have done the same in my place, but only after the consequences were unavoidable. I stopped caring what they thought. Growth has a way of shrinking the volume of unnecessary voices. That fall, I started my first full-time job. Nothing glamorous, entry-level, modest pay, but it came with structure, health insurance, and something I value deeply, predictability. I thrived in it, not because it was easy, but because hardship had trained me to manage pressure without falling apart. Deadlines didn't scare me. Difficult conversations didn't rattle me. When problems came up, I solved them. One afternoon, my supervisor called me into her office. "You handle stress differently," she said thoughtfully. "Where did you learn that?" I thought about the answer for a moment. "Life," I said. She smiled, like she understood more than I'd said. Outside of work, I started volunteering at a student support center on campus, helping first-generation students navigate paperwork, financial aid, and the invisible obstacles no brochure ever mentions. I recognized the look in their eyes immediately. The overwhelm, the fear of asking the wrong question, the exhaustion disguised as strength. I never told them my story outright. I didn't need to. I showed them instead. That winter, on the anniversary of my father's death, I did something new. I invited a few close friends over. We cooked dinner, laughed, shared memories not just of loss, but of survival. I spoke my father's name out loud without my voice breaking. That felt like healing. Later that night, alone in my room, I opened the folder I hadn't touched in months, the one labeled Evidence. Emails, documents, statements, the life-altering proof of what I'd been through. I didn't feel anger looking at it anymore. I felt clarity. This folder wasn't just about betrayal. It was about endurance, about knowing when to fight and knowing when to let go. I closed it and slid it into the back of my closet. Some battles don't need to be revisited to remain won. As the year came to a close, I sat at my desk writing goals for the next chapter of my life: career, independence, purpose. At the top of the page, I wrote one sentence and underlined it twice. I will never shrink myself to protect someone else's wrongdoing. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the past finally resting somewhere behind me instead of on my shoulders. What my aunt stole had delayed me, bruised me, forced me to grow faster than I should have, but it had not broken me. And as the future stretched out ahead, uncertain, challenging, real, I knew something with absolute certainty. The woman I had become was not an accident. She was forged, and in the final chapter of this story, I would decide exactly how that strength would be used. Strength changes how you see the world. Not in loud, obvious ways, but in the quiet moments where you realize you no longer flinch at things that once broke you open. I noticed it the first time my phone rang with an unknown number and my chest didn't tighten. I noticed it when deadlines piled up at work and I didn't panic. When criticism came and I listened without shrinking. When silence no longer felt like abandonment, but like space I had earned. I had stopped living in reaction mode. The past year had trained me to anticipate obstacles, not fear them, to read fine print, to trust my instincts, to document everything, to believe that preparation wasn't paranoia, it was protection. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at the Student Support Center where I volunteered. Nothing formal, just a small group of students struggling with financial aid appeals and family pressure. I stood in front of them, hands clasped, heart steady. "I'm not here to tell you it gets easy," I said. "I'm here to tell you it gets clearer." I didn't share names. I didn't relive details. I spoke about resilience, about systems that fail people, about learning how to advocate for yourself when no one else will. When I finished, a young woman approached me quietly. "My aunt took my inheritance too," she whispered. "Everyone tells me to let it go." I met her eyes. "You don't have to rush forgiveness," I said. "You're allowed to seek truth first." That night, driving home, I felt something shift again. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about purpose. I began exploring opportunities, graduate programs, certifications, nonprofit work. I wanted to understand systems deeply enough to help others navigate them without being destroyed by them, because I knew how it felt to be dismissed, to be underestimated, to be told to stay quiet for the sake of family peace, peace that only existed for people who benefited from silence. Then, unexpectedly, my aunt resurfaced, not directly, through family. "She's struggling," someone told me. "This has been hard on her." I nodded politely. I didn't ask how. I didn't ask why. I didn't feel guilty. Hardship doesn't erase harm. Consequences aren't cruelty. They are boundaries enforced by reality. That night, I wrote in my journal for a long time, pages filled with thoughts I didn't need to censor anymore. I wrote about my father, about the girl I had been, about the woman I was becoming. And then I wrote something that surprised me. I forgive myself for not seeing it sooner. That was the real breakthrough. Not forgiving her, but releasing the blame I'd been carrying that was never mine to begin with. Weeks later, I received an acceptance email. Graduate school, scholarship included. I stared at the screen, my breath shallow, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from awe. This wasn't luck. This was alignment. Everything I had endured had sharpened me for this next step. I accepted without hesitation, knowing exactly what it would cost and what it would give back. As I closed my laptop, I looked around my room at the quiet life I had built piece by piece. No chaos, no lies, no shadows, just truth. And I understood something deeply then. Betrayal may have forced my transformation, but intention would define my future. And there was still one final chapter left to tell. Graduate school started the way most new beginnings do, quietly, without ceremony. No one clapped when I logged into my first online orientation. No one announced that I had survived something that should have broken me. I sat alone at my desk, notebook open, coffee cooling beside me, listening to professors outline expectations and reading lists, like this was just another step. But I knew better. Every assignment carried the weight of where I'd been. Every syllabus felt like proof of where I was going. I balanced work and school the same way I had learned to balance everything else, carefully, intentionally, without letting one area collapse the rest. My classmates complained about stress, about deadlines, about workload. I listened, empathetic but distant, like someone who had lived through a different kind of pressure entirely. This was manageable. This was chosen. One afternoon, between meetings at work, I received an email that made my stomach drop in a way I hadn't felt in months. Subject: Request for Statement, Family Estate Review. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Someone had reopened questions about my father's estate, not about the insurance policy, but about other assets, smaller ones, accounts that had been overlooked. The wording was careful, neutral, professional, but I knew what it meant. My aunt hadn't stopped. She hadn't accepted accountability. She had only adjusted her strategy. Anger rose, sharp and familiar, but it didn't take over. It passed through me like a current I knew how to ride now. I forwarded the email to my attorney with a single line: "Please advise." Her response came quickly. "She's testing boundaries, seeing what she can still access. You're protected, but this may require one final clarification." Final. That word mattered. I gathered the requested documents calmly, updated statements, signed confirmations, proof that there was nothing left for her to reach without crossing an even clearer legal line. When the response went out, I felt something settle. This wasn't fear anymore. It was closure approaching. Weeks passed, no follow-ups, no challenges, just silence. The good kind. During that time, my life expanded in ways that had nothing to do with courtrooms or conflict. I formed friendships with people who knew me only as I was now, not as a grieving daughter, not as a betrayed niece, not as a cautionary tale whispered at family gatherings. Just Brianna, capable, focused, whole. One night, after finishing a paper that analyzed power dynamics in familial financial abuse, I sat back in my chair and laughed softly to myself. Not because it was funny, but because I finally understood how much I had changed. I was no longer studying to survive. I was studying to contribute, to help others recognize patterns before they became traps, to name things people preferred to keep unnamed, to remind those who felt small that preparation is not paranoia, it is wisdom. On the anniversary of my father's birthday, I visited his grave again. This time, I brought flowers and a calm heart. I talked to him about school, about work, about how I was okay, not in theory, but in practice. "I turned out strong," I said quietly. "You were right about me." As I stood there, phone buzzing with messages from classmates about group projects and deadlines, I realized something profound. My life was no longer centered around what had been taken from me. It was centered around what I was building. And just as I turned to leave, my phone buzzed again. A new email. Different sender. Official seal. I opened it slowly, reading each line with care. Because whatever it contained, I knew this was the moment that would finally determine whether the past stayed buried or demanded one last reckoning. The email was brief. No drama, no accusations, no threats. Just confirmation. The estate review was closed. No further claims, no outstanding questions, no remaining avenues for challenge. Final. I read it twice, then a third time, letting the words sink in slowly, like warm water after years of cold. My shoulders dropped without me realizing they'd been tense. My breath came easier. Something ancient and heavy finally loosened its grip. It was over. Not paused, not postponed, not waiting in the wings. Finished. I closed my laptop and sat there in the quiet, listening to the hum of the heater and the distant sounds of traffic outside. Ordinary sounds. Safe sounds. The kind you don't notice when your life is on fire, but treasure once the flames are out. For the first time since my father died, there was nothing left to fight. That realization scared me more than I expected. When you spend years in survival mode, peace can feel unfamiliar, almost suspicious. I had learned how to function under pressure, how to stay sharp, how to move forward even when the ground kept shifting beneath me. Now, the ground was still. So I learned something new. How to rest without guilt, how to dream without bracing for loss, how to exist without proving my strength every single day. Graduate school continued, work progressed, life expanded in quiet, steady ways. I moved into my own place, not fancy, not big, but mine. I filled it with plants, books, and light. I cooked meals without rushing. I slept through the night. Sometimes grief still visited. Not the sharp kind, the soft kind. It came when I saw fathers walking their daughters across campus, when I heard old songs he used to hum, when I imagined him sitting in the audience at my graduation again, clapping just a little too loud. But grief no longer controlled me. It lived beside gratitude now. I never reconciled with my aunt, not because I was bitter, but because boundaries don't require drama. Some people lose access not because you hate them, but because they proved they couldn't be trusted with your future. And I was done sacrificing my peace to preserve anyone else's comfort. One afternoon, while volunteering at the student center, a young woman asked me a question I didn't expect. How did you keep going when nobody believed you? I paused, choosing my words carefully. I believed me, I said, and I wrote everything down. She smiled like I handed her a map. That was when I understood the final meaning of everything I'd endured. My story wasn't meant to end in courtrooms or documents or recovered funds. It was meant to travel, to reach people who needed permission to trust themselves, to remind them that being quiet doesn't mean being weak, that evidence is power, that dignity doesn't need witnesses to exist. My father left me more than money. He left me integrity, work ethic, a belief that my future mattered enough to protect, even when he couldn't protect it himself. I honored that. And as I stood at my window that night, city lights flickering below, I felt something settle deep in my chest. Pride. Not the loud kind, the earned kind. I had been betrayed by blood, tested by grief, pushed beyond what was fair. And still, I rose. If you learned something new from my life story, please like this video, subscribe to join our community for more stories like mine, and comment down below where you're watching this video from. I'd truly love to know.